And thank you for inviting me to be here with you this evening. This is a very interesting topic to me, but it's also been quite challenging to try to decide how to narrow this, and it's almost impossible. The Abenaki people have almost 13,000 years of history in the Northeast, and so I'm going to try to encapsulate some of that. Who are the Abenaki, Wabanaki peoples? Where are they? As well as ideas about citizenship. Just trying to advance the screen. There we go. We're getting there. All right, so I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. This is an idea that is being used more and more throughout the United States and Canada. The idea of acknowledging the lands of the Indigenous people wherever it is that we live here in the United States or Canada. This one is a land acknowledgement that was just before the General Assembly in the State House in New Hampshire, with a possibility of accepting it as the official New Hampshire land acknowledgement. So New Hampshire is located on Indakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. New Hampshire acknowledges and honors with gratitude the spiritual and physical connection with the Aki, the land, the Neti, the water, the Lak. Yeah, I'm still taking Abenaki classes. The Lak, Wika, the flora, and the Awawasak, the fauna, as well as the Alnobak, the people, who have stewarded Indakina throughout the generations and who continue to carry forward the traditions of their ancestors. And that's really actually, that gets at the heart of what it is that we're doing here this evening, is looking at the ideas and the traditions of the Abenaki people and what their ideas of citizenship would be in relation to their beliefs about, the values. So I kind of have chunked this up into 4 parts. The first would be who and where the Abenaki and Wabanaki peoples, just to kind of orient you. And then pre-contact, before European contact, concepts of Wabanaki citizenship. And then next section is going to talk about Wabanaki citizenship under the colonial government and then United States federal, and I wrote the word oppression there and meant to apply it to both of them. And then we're still here, actually the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. So that's a lot to cover, and we're going to move into it and through it as fluently as I can. The name Abenaki and also Wabanaki, which is why I've been using both of them, they're actually the same word, the root word, if 2 different dialectic differences, or it could be how they're transliterated from English or French or Abenaki into written language, because there are different ways to write out the sounds that are part of, that used to speak Abenaki. And so if you read different books that have Abenaki references in them, you're going to see multiple spellings. And that's why it's sort of like when you read something that's in Arabic and then see it in English, because there are no vowels, for example, in Arabic. All vowels are expressed by diacritical marks. There's the wonk in me coming out. So they're just, why you'll see different readings. It means people of the East, or the place where the sun rises each morning. The dawn, or it's called the people of the dawn land. The Abenaki peoples have an ancient and continuing presence in New Hampshire. Right up to this day. Wabanaki confederacy includes 5 tribes: the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Micmac, the Maliseet, and the Western Abenaki, just sometimes called the Abenaki. So, as I mentioned in the land acknowledgement, the land is called Indakina. That's how we refer to it, and it means our homeland or our motherland. I should probably also mention that the word Abenaki or Wabanaki, the people of the Dawnland, that's how other people refer to the Abenaki people. Those people who live over in the East. Whereas the Abenaki themselves call, the word is the Almoba. It just means the people or the human beings. So in the map here, it shows that the places that are now called New Hampshire, Vermont, northern Massachusetts, Maine, southeastern Quebec from the south bank of the St. Lawrence and over to the east, and the Canadian maritime provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. All of that comprises Abenaki territory. So on the map here, you'll show that like down the south of New Hampshire and Vermont, it dips down a little bit into what we think of now as Massachusetts. And it's kind of, if you've ever traveled the Mohawk Trail that goes Route 2 that goes from the New York State over to Boston, everything sort of north of that is still part of Abenaki territory. So the Wabanaki people are part of a larger Algonquin culture group, and it spreads west past the, out through and past the Great Lakes. The Ojibwe, Chippewa people and Sauk and Fox and many others are part of the Anishinaabe people. And then it goes down the East Coast as far as where North Carolina is today, which was the traditional lands of the Pimlico people, and originally also the Tuscarora people who got driven out in the early 1700s and wound up becoming part of the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy went from being the 5 nations to being the 6 nations when they voted to take the Tuscarora in. I mention them because they're our neighbors immediately to the west of Abenaki territory. So they're traditional enemies, but they're also traditional family. It's an interesting part of the kinship relationships and how the Indigenous people work. They might have skirmishes or wars with one another, but a war was like a few days or maybe a few weeks. And they were, people were astonished when they met Europeans and found themselves embroiled in wars that went on for years or decades. That was unheard of here in Endakana. So how do we know about the Abenaki and their ancestors? First of all, we know from archaeological evidence. There are archaeological sites all throughout the Northeast with artifacts and that are dated 8,000 to 12.8 is the oldest we found here in the Northeast so far, or here in New Hampshire. And I'd like to give an example of this from my own hometown. I live in Lee, which is in the Seacoast area. And in Lee, there's a place called Wadley's Falls. And there was an archaeological dig that was done there in 1969. And it revealed that there had been 8,000 years of continuous occupation, the Abenaki people, a village, right up until the colonial period. So we can see how, Abenaki civilization came to a screeching dividing point from before pre-contact to after colonization. The oral traditions of the Abenaki is another way that we understand more about who the people are, our ancient ancestors, and what the beliefs were. So through traditional stories and histories, sacred stories, genealogies, wampum belts, which had mnemonic devices woven into them and were passed at treaty negotiations as part of an exchange of gifts, which was a part of diplomacy, was used quite a bit. I know I've learned a lot. I was trying to think about how we can understand about citizenship, especially through the traditional stories, because that's what I do in my real life, is being a traditional storyteller. And I started running through in my mind's eye just some of the stories that I tell and what they reveal about Abenaki values, what the citizens would value or espouse. And I came up with 4 or 5 right out the bat. I tell one about the cornhusk dolls called The Doll with No Face. And it's a wonderful, fun story. It's got lots of great details, but the bottom line is it talks about the importance of putting the needs of the community over the needs of self. It's kind of just mentioning the things that are related to this idea of citizenship. There's a story about Gluskabe. He's a culture hero of the Wabanaki peoples. And Gluskabe and the maple trees, and it's talking about the importance of a work ethic as opposed to laziness, which is something that is extremely important to the Abenaki people. Gluskabian is game bag, and it's thinking in terms of sustainability and seventh generation thinking. You know, what are we going to do that impacts our children and their children and their children and their children is the essential message of that story. And Gluskabian, the water monster, talks about the need to make water, clean water available to everyone because it sustains life. We see Gluskabian and the wind eagle talks about it teaches about the water cycle, water and air and how those interact together. So there are basic lessons of life, but there are also values that impact the Abenaki people and their ideas of what it means to be a citizen, the things you have to know to live well in the Abenaki context are embedded in those stories. And then we also have the thing that, you know, in Western view, we value, which are, you know, written historical records. So beginning in the late 1200s, when the Norse sagas were actually written down, we have those, we have explorers' notes, we have ship's logs, cartographers, you know, maps, Jesuit priest letters. The Jesuit relations from Canada reveals incredible detail about the Abenaki people. English and French colonists' letters and journals, treaties, Abenaki scholars of the 19th and early 20th centuries when the Abenaki became literate in English, French, and Abenaki. The scholars started creating dictionaries and translations of liturgy and all sorts of things. So that's kind of an interesting idea of the depth and scope of how we know about the Abenaki people. Just skip the page. Sorry, I'm trying to glance at my own notes because when I'm doing a PowerPoint and using Zoom, there's the boxes of everybody's faces covers part of what the text is up there. So pre-contact, Wabanaki view, responsibilities of citizenship. Recently, I had the privilege to work on a video with some colleagues of mine, Denise and Paul Pulio. And they're the Sagamoskwa, the Sagamo, the female head speaker, and the male speaker and chief of the Kosak band of the Pennacook Abenaki. And in the context of that, they sang, Denise sang a welcoming song. And I was looking at the translations and thinking it was very interesting to me that it reveals, again, the core value. Traditionally, songs were sung, people were traveling canoes on the rivers and the lakes. Those were the highways. Before there were roads, there were footpaths, there were trails, but how people traveled en masse was via water. And so when you were coming to another village, visiting, or if you were, you know, whatever the reasons you were coming, it was meant in a peaceful way. There was always a greeting song that the people who were travelers would sing. And so they were not only forewarning the people in the village that they were coming, but also messaging they were coming with good intent, as opposed to being a war party. And the words to the song that Denise sang in this video, they translate to peaceful hello, you know, or peaceful greetings. Peacefully, we reach out. So peaceful hello, peacefully sit a while, peaceful hello. Choose a long peace, peaceful hello, a superior lasting peace, a superior lasting peace through sitting, sharing, listening, and connecting with each other. Those were the values, the behaviors that were expected and are expected of Abenaki citizens, to come together, to consult, and to come to consensus are very, very important responsibilities in Abenaki terms for citizenship. So the Abenaki view of citizenship is shaped around the idea of family, extended familial relationships, and kinship ties. And these are within the Abenaki Wabanaki community and also with all of the surrounding people throughout the Northeast, because there were trade routes, there were treaty negotiations, there were trade negotiations, and it was very important to reach out. And what happened was that people got together for winter gathering and summer gathering, and that's when you would maybe meet a potential spouse, partner, meet up with extended family members, talk about the trade relationships between the two groups. And these were all citizen activities. And who you were related to built trust. So whether or not it was your auntie, your uncle, your grandmother, your grandfather, you know, somebody who is married to a cousin of yours, you know, those kinds of relationships were very important, are very important still within the Abenaki context. And leaders were and are chosen by consensus. So leaders serve the communities. The people's voices were and are heard in decision making. And leaders who take actions or speak words that don't represent the decisions of the community, decisions of the citizens, can be replaced. So on to the next part, European contact, colonization, United States government relations. This is kind of the unhappy portion of the event. In this whole series, I'm thinking that every other speaker is speaking about people who have, and you know, a huge part of my family, you know, is my European ancestry, including Mayflower ancestry, you know, Puritan migration. I don't actually think that anyone in my family came over. We have no Ellis Island people. Everybody was here before that, whether they were Abenaki or Puritan, predates that. But the relationship between the Abenaki people and the colonists was pressured from the beginning because they were caught between New England and New France with two completely different ideas from those two countries who were not only competing for goods, for commodities, but also competing religions and a war for empire that was engaged in Europe and was brought to these shores. So I'm going to do a little bit of a background here on how European contact happened. Interestingly enough, I think all of us have probably heard about the Vikings hitting the Northeast coast. It was actually conclusively, scientifically proven last year that they were here. They landed, Leif Erikson, in 1021. So now 1,001 years ago. It was done by dating tree rings using solar flare that showed up in the rings of the trees. It was somehow, I'm not a scientist, but I thought it was so fascinating. So they established a colony in what's called Lonsdale Meadow, Newfoundland. And the Vikings called it Vinland, so that's how it turns up in the sagas. They encountered indigenous people in the north, actually north of the Abenaki, who the Norse called Skraelings, and that was a pejorative term that meant little men or barbarians. Almost every word that the colonists had for the people who already lived here. In English, it was savage. In French, it was sauvage. It sounded so much more elegant, but it still meant savage. So the Europeans were seeing the Abenaki as other from the beginning. John Cabot sailed for England for Henry VII in 1496. He had to turn back. 1497 actually made landfall and didn't interact with the indigenous people, but did take some artifacts back. 1498, he got a letter of marque for a new voyage and disappeared. By 1499, he was off. But what he did, what's important to understand, is even though his exploration was inept, it became the basis for England's claim to North America, and that very much impacted the Abenaki. Verrazano sailed for France, 1524. So the French wound up claiming north of Abenaki, Wabanaki territory. The English wound up claiming south of Wabanaki, Abenaki territory. And that put the Abenaki smack between these two empires battling out to control what they thought they had every right to claim, which is why I put this image here of John Cabot planting his flag and claiming the land for, even though he hadn't met anybody, he knew nothing about it, claimed the land for the King of England. And every explorer did that. Where they planted the pole was representing extending the universe of the empire of whatever king or queen, whatever monarch they were sailing for, without any consideration for the people who already lived here. Throughout all the 1500s, Basque fishermen were fishing those cod of George's bank waters. So there were many interactions with the Abenaki people. And this continued exploration. John Smith sailed up and down the coast from Nova Scotia to Virginia in 1614 and named Smith Isles, our Isles of Shoals that are just off the coast here of New Hampshire and Maine for himself. It's not what the Abenaki called it, and they didn't call it the Isles of Shoals either, but that's not a bad translation. Quebec colony was established in 1608 as New France, the Plymouth colony, 1620. Brian Portsmouth, 1623. We're coming up on the 400th year of colonial hegemony, let's say, colonial taking over of New Hampshire and changing citizenship ideas and citizenship relationships permanently. Boston, Massachusetts Bay Colony, established in 1630, and Montreal, again, New France, in 1642. So for over 100 years, a barrage of one wave after another came. And this created a tremendous clash of culture and worldviews. To the Abenaki people, which I have on the left side of the screen, the earth is, there's a story about the earth on Turtle's back. And so all of North America is referred to often as Turtle Island. And how the Abenaki saw themselves and still do see themselves as is part of this creation that Tabaldak, the owner creator, or Gichi Musk, the great spirit, in other words, God, created, and that all of these things are interrelated. And the Abenaki have a responsibility to speak for the parts of creation that cannot speak for themselves. So to be protectors and defenders of the water and the air, and the bird people, the animal people, the rock people, the plant people, and the Almaba, the human beings, interact with all of these with respect and appreciation. When animals or birds or fish were taken for food or plants are taken, their traditional value is to give thanks and to only take what you need. And so it's seen as sustainability again, this idea of we are the seventh generation from our ancestors and the seventh generation from our descendants. We are continuation, guardians and stewards of the earth and all it holds. And that responsibility is given by a creator. So that's something that's taken into account in the responsibilities of citizenship. English colonists, particularly, and French colonists, much more what we call stratified existence. So rich white men at the top, middle-class men underneath them, and it's in a pyramid because the wider base actually represents the larger number of the population. So there were fewer rich white men at the top, but they held all the power, or most of it. Middle-class white men underneath that, white indentured servants underneath that, and they had the potential over a period of 7 or more years to earn their freedom and become middle class. Underneath that, freed blacks, underneath that, black slaves, and underneath that, Native Americans, and all other people of color. And this is the point of view of the guy sitting at the top of the pinnacle. You had to be a man and a landowner, and preferably wealthy to lead the European society. And so this is the worldview, and they seeing the people of color. So African people, all indigenous people of the Americas, Hispanic people, anyone with darker skin, that was a justification used to disenfranchise and to exclude those people from citizenship. So it immediately created tension. Take just a moment here. We're doing 5 for time. Okay. So some of the things that happened as a result of colonization. First of all, diseases that the people had no immunity to, the Abenaki and all the indigenous people. So measles, smallpox, the list goes on and on and on. And there was a tremendous plague of something that was brought over by the rats on the European ships. And so there was a period from 1616 to 1619 called the Great Dying, where many, thousands, it's estimated as many as 90 to 95% of the indigenous population of the Northeast died. And that was up to the year before the Mayflower landed. So in 1600, 20 years, 20 years before the Mayflower landed, the thought is that there were estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people living in New England, Native American people, and in Dakanai. And then you read in the Pilgrim journals that the Pilgrims found this land that had been cleared, and they referred to it as, by the power and the glory of God, that these people had been removed from the path of the Pilgrims, and God had made this land available for these people from England to settle at Patuxet and then begin encroaching further and further north, south, and inland, which led to a period of over 100 years of warfare, off and on. And in warfare, the English captured Abenaki people, and if they didn't outright kill the warriors, they were sold into slavery. So out of Boston, many people were sent down to the Caribbean, where they just disappeared. They were enslaved on the plantations down there. There was also bounty hunting. Spend a few minutes talking about these things, because what this did, this relationship, particularly acrimonious between the English and the Abenaki, was complete negation of any possible rights of citizenship within the English context. So it started in 1637 with the Massachusetts Bay making war, Connecticut and Rhode Island joining in, Massachusetts Bay against the Pequot people. In 1675 and 76, King Philip's War, also known as his Metacom's War, Metacom is his name in his own language, son of Massasoit. And the Abenaki here in New Hampshire had established treaty relations with the Wampanoag people. King Philip, that Metacom was part of that. And so the Abenaki people were drawn into the conflict and were allies with the Wampanoags. Any one of these, there are books written on them, on every single one of these topics, trying hard to not go too deeply into detail. King William's War, 1689 to 1679, Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, these years-long wars. That the Abenaki were drawn in between the English and French and forced to side with one or the other just to protect their families. Lovewell's War, Rail's War, has several different names, but 1722, 1725. King George's War, 1745 to 48, that was a relatively short one. The French and Indian War started out actually in Ohio territory, but was played out in the entire Northeast. So it was called the 7 Years' War in Europe. It was actually 9 years war here. It started 2 years here before it became spread to Europe. And then the American Revolution. And the Abenaki were drawn into all of these, whether they wanted to or not, for the purpose of surviving. So, better part of a century from the time of King Philip's War, we have all these wars going on. As I mentioned, Abenaki warriors were taken and either killed brutally right off the bat or sent in slavery. And the idea to get them out of New England so they could fight the English again. And when I say, the brutality, we don't understand necessarily how this went, but in Europe, for example, what happened to Metacom at the end of the war, or during the war, was that he was caught, he was killed, he was beheaded, he was drawn and quartered, well, he was quartered, but his head wound up on a pike in Plymouth, Massachusetts for 20 years. And this was typical of how the English used these psychological warfare kinds of tactics. Bounty hunting. In order to reduce the Native American population in Dakina, bounties were placed on the lives of the Wabanaki people. There's actually a new film out, a documentary just called Bounty, that focuses on 1755 proclamation by Governor Phipps of Massachusetts that paid certain amounts of money for bodies of Penobscot people who are part of the Wabanaki to be taken to Boston, or slightly less money to just carry their scalps, because that wouldn't be as heavy. I'm saying this in a very, sorry, but it's hard to talk about this. This is a copy of that particular bounty flyer. Every male Penobscot Indian over the age of 12 shall Boston take them to Boston, 50 pounds. Every scalp of a male Penobscot over the age of 12, you get 40 pounds just for taking their scalp down, not the whole person. And the same things, female Penobscots taken and brought in aforesaid, in other words, dead, to Boston. And males under the age of 12, 25 pounds, or just to take their scalps, 20 pounds. And so this was how Boston in 1755, how the governor of Massachusetts colony was going to reduce the population of their enemy. Okay, colonial diplomacy and treaty negotiations. With all those wars, there were many ends of the wars, ends of conflict, and they had to be negotiated. I've taken one as an example, the Treaty of Portsmouth, that was signed in 1713 here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, at the end of Queen Anne's War. The Wabanaki wanted three things. First of all, they wanted an explanation of why it was that the English and French were telling them who got control of the Wabanaki land, who's for control of Indakina. The Wabanaki wanted at that time in that negotiation three things. They wanted a limitation of the English expansion into their nations any further, so they could preserve the culture, seasonal hunting and fishing grounds, planting grounds. They wanted trustworthy trade partners from the English in more convenient trading locations. And they wanted diplomatic protocols, including exchange of gifts happening. Governor Dudley there was a 3-day treaty conference before the treaty was signed. Governor Dudley of Massachusetts came up, and there were finally some New Hampshire delegates included in the negotiations. New Hampshire was not a colony on its own yet. It didn't happen until a little bit later. But this was the first time New Hampshire, Detroit men, were included in the negotiations. And he spent a good part of his time, Dudley, chiding the Abenaki for breaking 5 previous treaties without taking into consideration that the English had done the same thing. After the conference, Governor Dudley and the delegates to the conference, including the 8 or 10 Abenaki representatives who had come there, went up to Casco to meet with the rest of the tribal chieftains to have this treaty ratified. And one of the Wabanaki speakers at Casco Base, so speaker is for the chiefs, said, when we heard there was peace between England and France, we were very glad. Well, yes, because it had been a war going on for a decade or more, and hoped we should have peace here. If the Queen at home makes this peace contained in those articles as strong and durable as the earth, we for our parts should endeavor to make it strong and firm here. Then the English explained that the Queen, Great Britain's arms, the weaponry, was very superior to those of the King of France, and he had surrendered up Newfoundland and the land on this side, in other words, the land in the Northeast here, to the Queen of England. So the members of the First Nations replied, the French never said anything to us about it, and we wonder how it was that they could give it away without asking us. God having first placed us here and having nothing to do with us giving it away. So, from the beginning, that's what the Wabanaki were concerned with. Why were the English and French deciding who was going to control Indochina? So I'm going to move on to the roots of the Abenaki-Wabanaki relationship with the United States government. At the end of the American Revolution, the United States government recognized amongst the Wabanaki, the Penobscot, the Micmac, the Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy people due to treaties that have been signed at various times with the Continental Congress. And so when the United States was formed, because those treaties were signed before the formation of the nation, and there's a pre-existing relationship, they became eventually what's called federally recognized tribes in the United States, which meant they had a government-to-government relationship with the United States, and federally recognized tribes still do to this day. However, the Western Abenaki, so it's people mostly in southern Maine, all of New Hampshire, all of Vermont, and northern Massachusetts, had sided with the French during the 7 Years' War, during the French and Indian War, and of course the French lost. And then 12 years later, the Abenaki were looking at the British, who had been so strong, they'd been able to defeat the French allies, and thought, well, they should side with them against the Americans. And so, consequently, when the British did not win the American Revolutionary War, there were no treaties. The Abenaki, Western Abenaki had none with the Continental Congress, and they were not and did not become federally recognized tribes, and still are not federally recognized. So the relationship between the United States and the Western Abenaki was non-existent, politically speaking, from the get-go. So there were Abenaki citizens, and they were not considered citizens of the United States. In fact, no Native American people were considered citizens of the United States at that time. And this relationship of continually pushing the Abenaki people further and further away culminated with the Indian Removal Act of 1830 in the early national period of the United States. And the purpose was to make land available east of the Mississippi for the poor and middle-class white settlers, and move all of the indigenous people out west, primarily to what was referred to as Oklahoma Territory at that point. At one point, I understand there were over 60 tribes, different cultures, different languages, different everything, religions, all squished into Oklahoma Territory. So one can only imagine the acrimony and the battling ideas of citizenship that were being worked out there. All of the New England wars had forced many of the surviving Abenaki people to either participate in the wars or to remove themselves, northern or western, or to live in very remote areas, or especially after 1830, to retreat up to Canada, maybe come back when things cooled off. Many assimilated because they had intermarried with French or Scottish or Irish colonists, and were hiding, what's called hiding in plain sight. So assimilating, not necessarily acculturating, but looking like, acting like, sounding like the people who lived around them. And then the Indian Removal Act made the situation in New Hampshire even more untenable for the Abenaki people. So when this law passed, it became legal to move all indigenous people east of the Mississippi to Oklahoma Territory, which, of course, since they weren't citizens, they could be treated that way. And in effect, we hear about, the Trail of Tears, and I'm not negating that. It would happen there with the Cherokee people and the 5 civilized tribes in the South was heartbreaking. But it's important, I think, to understand, to know this impacted indigenous people in the entire eastern part of what is now the United States. Okay, so survival strategies I've already talked about, but I'm just going to zoom through this. But I haven't talked about the fact that this idea of hiding in plain sight, if one appeared to be either Black or white, it was safer than being Native American in the Northeast here, right up through the 1970s. And there was also forced acculturation and assimilation into American and Canadian society. But in spite of that, there is still Abenaki people here. In the 1880s to the 1920s, many Abenaki people were living in the very northern parts of Vermont, New Hampshire, and the Western Abenaki. And of course, up on the coast, the other 4 Wabanaki tribes at that point had reservation land. Their situation was not great, but they not by any stretch of the imagination, but at least they did have some land that they could stay on. Although a lot of those people wound up going up to Canada seasonally as well, and then returning when things coming back. So in this period of time, the 1880s to the 1920s, for example, these 2 pictures are from postcards showing a summer encampment in Intervale, New Hampshire, where Abenaki people came down who had originally been from New Hampshire, Vermont, and came to this group of people, this family, to the Intervale, New Hampshire every summer, and were selling baskets and other art they've made in the wintertime up in Canada to the tourists in those big white hotels all throughout the Northeast. The 1920s through the 1970s, the Abenaki continued to share parts of their culture with each other, but stayed under the radar by assimilating. I actually put this picture here. These are Mohawk children, actually, but they're my family. These are my husband, the young man there is my husband's grandfather and his 3 sisters, so my husband's grandfather and 3 great aunts, who wound up, as many Indigenous people did, moving to the cities, to the greater Boston area and just north of Boston for work in the mills and the sorts of things by that period of time. There was also the whole epidemic of forced assimilation, children being taken forcibly from their families and put in boarding schools where they were forced to speak English, had their hair cut, they couldn't wear their own clothing they were familiar with. They were taken from their families. They were treated abominably. And we've heard a lot about this recently. The first one in the United States was the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, which is, it was run by the Army or a former Army officer. We truly don't know. This is something that our new Secretary of the Interior is looking into. How many of these boarding schools there were in the United States. The records weren't kept the way they were in Canada. But we do know that in the last year or so, there have been horrendous discoveries of burial grounds of children who died in these institutions, far, far away from their families. And as they're being discovered, they're being repatriated to their homelands. There were also forced adoptions out of tribes that went on for decades, where children were taken from their parents simply because they were Indians. This happened throughout Wabanaki territory as well as across the entire United States. So Wabanaki people wound up in boarding schools or wound up being adopted to white families so they could be taught how to be American. Was the idea. So infringing again on the citizenship rights of the Abenaki. World War I and World War II, the Abenaki and Native Americans all throughout our country fought. They fought in every war since the American Revolution. There were Native Americans who fought on the side of the colonists in the American Revolution in every war since then. So the interesting thing to me was that the Native American peoples, none of them, including the Wabanaki peoples, were granted citizenship by the United States until 1940. And I can only think that was in preparation for World War II, because there were many, many, many Native men and women who served in World War II. So 1940, Native Americans were granted the United States citizenship. But the interesting thing is, if the Native American people are the only people, and including Wabanakis, if that both their parents were born here in the United States, still can have dual citizenship. There are no other American people who are in that category. So no one else can have dual citizenship in this way, with both parents being born in the United States. The GI Bill was passed in 1946. And this gave many returning GIs, including a fairly large percentage of Native American GIs, the opportunity to further their educations. And this new educational opportunity was kind of a mixed blessing, because if they were going to take advantage of this, people, if they were in recognized tribes and had, if they had reservations, there were no jobs. There was nothing to do with that training at that time on the reservations. So many moved to cities. In the 1970s, the American Indian movement began sort of a pan-Indian awareness, and it's starting to connect amongst the people. This started with the taking of Wounded Knee around 1970, 72, 73. I don't recall exact year. I do remember I had just graduated from high school, so I guess maybe it was 73. The Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978, at least in theory, making it not possible for children to be taken away from their parents without cause anymore. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1978. This finally gave freedom for the Indigenous peoples to practice their own religions. Prior to that point, it was illegal. 1980, the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act was passed. And it was a good beginning, but it was not comprehensive by any means in terms of what we would think of this as reconciliation. The Indian Arts and Crafts Act was passed in 1990, which protects Native American arts and crafts, which was a main livelihood for people who were completely disenfranchised from the United States to make these things the way the earlier slide showed. So that made it so that you couldn't pass off things made in other countries or by non-Indians as Indian art. And the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act was passed in 1990. And this made way for many Indigenous people whose bodies had wound up in museums all throughout the United States to be repatriated back to their own tribes for burial. That's a process that's still ongoing. It's something the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs still helps to facilitate. It was recently at a local museum here in the Seacoast, just a jawbone found, and research will have to be done on how that was acquired, what the provenance is. So I'm winding up, coming down the home stretch here, which is probably not a moment too soon. What we're doing, 5:56. There's a growing interest in New Hampshire for supporting Abenaki and Wabanaki reconciliation initiatives, land acknowledgements, museum exhibits, public education programs like this evening's presentation, and inclusion in Native American and Indigenous studies programs. For example, UNH, I think, is now just in its third year of having that as a minor. And in 2011, just only that long ago, 11 years ago, the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs was established under RSA 12A in New Hampshire, and the idea is to provide a plethora of services to all Indigenous people who live in New Hampshire, not only the Native Americans. But it astonishes me, that it took until 2011 for the state of New Hampshire to acknowledge that there is an Indigenous population. And the thing that the foremost thing that I'm involved in as an educator through the commission and other initiatives is just this message that, that we're still here. There are Indigenous people, there are Abenaki people's descendants here in New Hampshire. We're almost completely written out of New Hampshire history, and we're trying to reclaim. It's really hard for our children and grandchildren to hear in school that they don't exist, and they do hear that. In this century, the good news is the Abenaki people in the state of New Hampshire have been working with non-Indigenous allies and actively advocating for laws to educate the citizens of New Hampshire about Indigenous people. The bad news is that a proposed bill to create Indigenous Peoples Day to replace Columbus Day failed in the New Hampshire General Assembly last year. And this week, two separate bills failed in the General Assembly, failed to pass. There was one to establish that land recognition statement that I read at the beginning of our talk as the official land recognition statement of New Hampshire. We even took out that pesky little clause about this being unceded land, and yet it was not something that was passed. And then also even though it's been 19 years since the New Hampshire Board of Education promoted prohibiting Native American character mascots in New Hampshire schools, this bill to do that in New Hampshire to, make it not possible, no longer allowable for there to be Indian mascots in schools was defeated and will not be passed in New Hampshire this session at any rate. There's in this century, actually in this last about 10, 20 years ago at the most, I think it's within the last 10 or 15 years, 4 Vermont tribes have gained state recognition in Vermont, only in Vermont state, not federal recognition. New Hampshire doesn't even has no process at all for a tribe to become state recognized in New Hampshire, but there are New Hampshire tribes that are working to establish themselves and get the paperwork in order, and heading toward the idea of federal recognition. It's a process that takes decades and millions of dollars. There's a Western Abenaki language program that's been started as part of the Good News, and part of the news we establish as good news for all of the Indigenous people of the United States is that we have our first appointed cabinet member, Deb Holland, who's the Luna Pueblo, as the Secretary of the Interior. And she has appointed Daryl LeCount, who's Turtle Mountain Banded Chippewa, as the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He's actually the second Native American to ever hold that position. The last one was Eli Parker, the Seneca, in 1869 to 1871. So it's been a long time coming to have this kind of representation for people like the Wabanaki, Abenaki peoples who are every bit modern American people and American citizens, but who also have a strong historic and cultural heritage here in New Hampshire and values of citizenship that can be a real bounty, could be truly a blessing to share with American people. When we stop and think about it, American people as a whole today, all American people, are much more like the Indigenous ancestors of the Wabanaki and Abenaki than they are like the English or French colonists who came in the 1600s. And yet that's the history that we're familiar with. So thank you very much for letting me speak with you this evening. I so appreciate having been invited. I know that I covered a tremendous amount of information. And so I'm going to ask Michael if there were any questions that popped up that you might like to relay to me.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, I'm
sharing.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I will, people are starting to put questions in and I will start reading off some of those. I did want to just say, one, thanks, Anne, for being part of the series. We really appreciate you being here tonight. This is normally where you would get applause, but that doesn't really happen well on Zoom. So wanted to make sure we recognize you there. I also, while people are putting questions in the chat, which we encourage you to do, wanted to say that the next speaker in this program is going to be on April 8th at 5 p.m. Johan Miem is going to talk about educating the nation, public schools, and our democracy, past, present, and future. So please join us for that. And also save the date for our keynote in the program, who is coming on May 5th in person. May 26th in person at 5 p.m. Claudia Rankin on citizenship. So those are things to look for. Those are brought to you in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, but also through the support of people like you in the state is another part of how these things happen. So I'm going to just start hitting questions, Anne, and I'll let you tell me when you need another one. But we had a question from Sandy Blanchard who who asked what can and should we be doing to make things right now to help to heal the hundreds of years of wrongdoing?
Oh, there's so much. I cannot begin enough to stress education about the Abenaki people. There are several resources that I've provided, a couple of pages of resources that we can make available to you. And the first page are some books by Lisa Brooks and also by Colin Calloway. Colin Calloway is a professor at Dartmouth. He's actually British. Maybe he's an American citizen by now. He's been at Dartmouth forever. And any read by him is informative about the Indigenous people. Lisa Brooks has written two amazing texts about the Abenaki Wabanaki people. One's called The Common Pot, and the other is called Our Beloved Kin. And they both shed a great deal of light on Abenaki Wabanaki history and how it relates to all the Indigenous people of New England. I recommend them highly. I also give a page of different websites. And I hope that people can inform themselves through looking. All those books have bibliographies at the back, works cited, that are just a gold mine. And the websites provide a lot of sources as well. So I encourage you to take a look at them. The more you can learn about the Abenaki people and look at, especially these websites, there are a couple of groups. One that pops to mind is one that I'm a member of, the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective, which is working with some Abenaki elders here in New Hampshire as an advisor capacity, but it's mostly allies, mostly non-Indigenous allies who are doing tremendous work. And there's a really good website there that you can click into to start informing yourself. Ready for another one.
Another question was from Fran Brokaw, and I think we already have kind of heard about your opinion about formally recognizing the Abenaki in the state. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the important, why that's so, you see that as so important to have that recognition.
It could be, have state recognition could be for the various tribal groups, Abenaki tribal groups in New Hampshire, a step toward, first of all, again, that idea of educating the rest of the citizens of New Hampshire that all of the last Old Mary and Old Joe, the last Indian in their community, stories that are in almost every town history in New Hampshire and New England are not actually correct. There couldn't have been that many last Indians, for one thing, but it was a way of, I think, reassuring the colonists and the early Americans that threat to what they wanted to achieve was gone. So state recognition can help with the identification of a group, could ease them toward maybe, perhaps, accessing the commission. But we know there are so many people who just don't even know the commission exists, and it's there to serve all the Indigenous people in New Hampshire. I encourage you to take a look at that RSA. There is a whole laundry list of things that we do, are charged to do, and would be happy to work with people. But it's just as difficult for us to locate and work with all the Indigenous people in New Hampshire as it is for anyone else. We've been so good at hiding in plain sight that people don't necessarily, make themselves known as Abenaki descendants because it's challenged. Nobody asked me to prove that I had a Swedish great-great-grandmother, or that I have Irish heritage or Scottish heritage or Welsh heritage, which I do, and English, and Northern European. No one's ever asked me to prove that. But if you mention that you have Native American heritage, people automatically want to know how Indian are you? My typical answer is my pinky, probably. My answer is, without that ancestry, I wouldn't be here. We are the culmination of all of our ancestors. That makes them all important. And to me, here is where I live. I don't live in Wales or England or Ireland or Scotland. I live here. This is where I wanted my children to understand, where their roots were. So state recognition can help accomplish all of that. It can also be as all of the documentation that would have to be gathered in order to achieve state recognition could also be used on the road to applying for federal recognition. As I understand, I'm having a senior moment. It's either 574 or 594. I think it's 594. Anyway, federally recognized tribes in the United States, a huge number, and over 200 that are not federally recognized. Of them, some of those groups are working toward achieving federal recognition, which will give them, when that happens, government to government negotiating status with the United States. It's actually, if you look at I taught civics for a while, if you look at a chart of our government and how it breaks down, most people are not aware that there's the United States government, and the next level down is actually not the state governments, it's the relationship of the federal government to the federally recognized governments of the native tribes. And then the state governments is the next step, which is kind of interesting mind switch. So those are my thoughts off the cuff about state recognition.
I also have a comment. I'm more or less just working down comments from the top. So Richard Morey was hoping to hear more about Abenaki ideas on communal responsibility and individual responsibilities or rights as part of the concept of citizenship. You've mentioned it at the beginning, but.
Yeah, I will mention this. If you look at the websites, actually you can start if you can find it, good luck. The website for the commission. It's kind of buried somewhere in the Division of Historical Resources website, but you can probably Google it. There's a list of Abenaki groups in New Hampshire and Vermont and some other New England groups. But at any rate, if you take a look at them, almost all of them have a constitution written up. I'm thinking right now of the Cossack Band of the Pennacook Abenaki. They have a 17-page constitution. I happened to look at Missisquoi, which is one of the 4 state recognized tribes in Vermont. They have a constitution. When you read them, you see what those ideas are about the values and the responsibilities of citizenship. But I couldn't hit us with 17 and 20-page documents tonight. Just to know they're there, and all of these tribes and tribal groups have websites and lots of good information.
So I am moving a little bit because I know we're going to not be able to answer all the questions. And one of these actually resonated a little with me. Barbara Bald was asking about, you mentioned consensus as a way of making decisions. How did that work when consensus wasn't happening? I'm familiar with consensus through kind of Quaker practice, but I don't know, and Barbara's asking about, what did that mean? How did you reach consensus?
You know, that it meant sitting in council. It still does. You know, the song that I read the words to, the greeting song about come, you know, peaceful hello, come and sit a while and we'll talk and we'll share. It's not a fast process. It's a process that requires patience. Even now, there are the groups that I'm aware of in New England. There are councils, people come together. Sometimes it's the whole group, sometimes it's some appointed elders. It depends on the structure of the tribe. But people come together, literally sit together and bring ideas forward, consult about them. There can be incredible differing opinions, but eventually there will be some consensus that's reached or the idea is set aside until it can be thought about over and talked about again. But that's how it's done. It's done mindfully and thoughtfully and usually without rush.
And I'm trying to group together some of the questions because I know we're not going to have time for all of them. One of the questions that came up, and I know this is something that I've also heard other people talk about, is terminology. You know, Native American, Indigenous people. It's sometimes confusing to understand what terms are preferred and why and how. Can you address any of that?
Yeah, I can. I'll try. I mean, some go in and out of vogue. Some can be used within the group, but others can't. Which happens with various groups. You cannot usually go wrong using the actual tribal name. It's the best choice. If you're talking about Western Abenaki people, you know, in New Hampshire, or Western Abenaki people in Vermont, or the Penobscot people up in Maine, or the Passamaquoddy people up in Maine, or the Micmac, Maliseet people, you know, the Maliseet, the Holton Band of Maliseet way up in Holton, Maine. If you can use the tribal names, that's the most accurate and most respectful way to do it. Other terms that seem to be still acceptable are American Indian, Native American, and Indigenous with a capital I. There have been other terms used, you know, just Indians, which they're not because that's India, Amerindians, that was one that was scholars were using for a while. It didn't make anybody happy. And pejorative terms are completely out of balance, which is where that line falls that all the mascots tend to use and abuse. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's good to kind of like surface all these different terms, because I think it's confusing. I think someone else was commenting, sorry, this was kind of my part of the question as well, was tribes versus nations versus bands is another kind of area, I think, of confusion for a lot of people.
The groups name themselves, and so some use the word tribe, some use the word nations, some just use the word people. And each one, again, it's I think important to look at the group you're referring to. And one way to do that nowadays, I mean, so easy, Google, our buddy Google, look them up, find their website, see what they're calling themselves. It's a good starting place. The internet and education have been great levelers and are assisting the Indigenous peoples to reach out to each other in ways that were not possible 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that has been a tremendous boon as well. But you can use it too, the power of search engines.
Well, and it is 6:15, and I'm gonna have to let you go. There are so many more questions, and I apologize. I was zooming around trying to see if I could cluster them, and I know I didn't hit all of them, so I apologize to everyone for not quite getting them all in order. But I hope you will follow up and you will ask questions, and we will continue to have this conversation. So thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for joining us. Again, we will be meeting back on April 8th for the next step in this conversation, and we hope you will join us then. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it.